Because of the CBS News special report which follows, Mayberry RFD will not be presented tonight, but will return next week at its regularly scheduled time over most of these stations. The Draft Lottery, a live report on tonight's picking of the birth dates for the draft. Here at Selective Service Headquarters in Washington is CBS News correspondent Roger Mudd.
Conscription is practice of ordering people into the armed services. The United States used conscription to draft millions of citizens into multiple wars between the 18th and 20th centuries. During the American Revolution, towns would enact militia laws which called for all able-bodied males to enlist in their local militias and serve for about a year. When the War of 1812 started, the Madison administration tried to pass the first national draft of 40,000 men, but this was shot down by New Hampshire Representative Daniel Webster, who said that it had no foundation in the Constitution. When shots were fired at Fort Sumter and the Civil War started in 1860, both sides started to draft men into the war. The Confederate States of America, who had a population of around 9 million, started drafting its citizens in 1862, and a year later, the Union, who had a population of around 22 million, started to draft its citizens. However, this draft was different than the draft that would be used in World War II and the Vietnam War, because in this draft, wealthy citizens could pay $300 to be exempt, or they could find a substitute draftee. This led to protests and riots across the country because Americans felt that this was unfair to the lower and middle classes who could not afford to pay the $300. This type of draft continued until 1940 when Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Selective Service Act, which required all men 21 through 36 to register, removed the exemption fee, and also allowed people to sign up as an objector, which meant they did not have to go to war because of religious beliefs. By the end of World War II, over 10 million men have been drafted overseas. When World War II ended, Vietnam was split in two. There was Communist Northern Vietnam that was led by Ho Chi Minh and Democratic Southern Vietnam that was ruled by the French. In November 1946, with the intention of getting Northern Vietnam back, the French bombarded the port of Haiphong and the Vietnam War began. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy sent 1,000 U.S. military advisors to help the Southern Vietnamese and with the intent of containing communism. Then 3 years later, on August 2nd, 1964, 3 Northern Vietnamese torpedo boats fired at the USS Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin, causing the U.S. to enter the war. By 1966, there were 200,000 U.S. soldiers in Vietnam with Operation Rolling Thunder.
If you were draft age eligible at 18, you had a draft number, and they pulled it by your birthday. And my number was number 66. So I didn't think it was a big deal. I went to South Carolina for 2 years. At 18, I graduated from high school. I did not have the sufficient number of hours to be deferred because it was kind of complicated and you had to take so many per semester, so I got drafted. The first probably 160 out of the 365 numbers got drafted. If you had a higher draft number, you didn't go. It was like a lottery.
Protests started in 1965 when the draft was updated from 3,000 to 33,000 soldiers a month. On October 15, 1965, during a protest held by the National Coordinating Committee to End War in Vietnam in New York City, David Miller became the first person to publicly burn his draft card. By May 1966, over 50% of Americans thought that the United States made a mistake by going into Vietnam. Young men did everything they could to get out of the draft. Some destroyed their draft card. Some signed up as religious objectors, and others even moved out of the country, often moving to Canada. In December 1969, the final draft lottery was held on the CBS Evening News, and after a few days, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would start withdrawing troops from Vietnam. In 1973, Nixon officially ended the draft, transforming the United States into an all-volunteer military. Then, on his first day in office, President Jimmy Carter pardoned all draft dodgers and allowed ones who had fled to Canada to come back to the United States.
At age 19, I was drafted in the Army. I went to Fort Bragg, Fort Benning, then I went to NCO school then I went to Ranger School at Fort Benning. I was real gung-ho, when you're 19 and you played football and you're all this, and the military really brainwashes you. They talk about up the hill, I could do 17 pull-ups when I was that age. I got a perfect on the everything. I was like, they they wanted me to go to officer candidate school, but you had to re-enlist for 2 years. I said I wouldn't, so I was made an instant in 6 months. Went from private. The ranks in the military are private. Then you have specialists. You have then private first class, private second class. That's E1, E2. Then you have specialist, and then you have corporal, and then you have sergeant. I was made a sergeant after 6 months. I went to Vietnam as a sergeant. My MOS, military occupation status, was light weapons, infantry, platoon, sergeant. Okay, so I'm going over there, and I show up, and there's a bunch of guys, kind of like, you guys standing there, like, what do we do, Sarge? I said, almost, what the hell do I do?
Conscription is very important in United States history. In the Vietnam War, 1.7 of the 9 million men were drafted, and when the war was over, 60,000 troops had died, and 1,000 of them were from South Carolina. That's not mentioning the hundreds of thousands that were wounded in the war. Conscription divided the country in two. On one side, you had the anti-draft side that felt the draft was unconstitutional for the government to draft citizens. The most famous person to refuse military service was boxer Muhammad Ali, who famously said,
"They never lynched me. They never put no dogs on me. They never robbed me of my nationality, raped and killed my mother and father. Well, I'm going to shoot them for what? How am I going to shoot them? Them little poor little black people, little babies and children and women. How can I shoot them poor people? Just take me to jail."
And was banned from boxing 3 years because of it. On the other side of the argument was the pro-draft side that thought all young men should sign up for the draft. People like Representative Charlie Rangel, who thinks the draft should be reinstated in case of a war with Syria. The draft could easily be reinstated, so we need to learn from our past. Conscription is also very important in South Carolina's history. When the Confederacy started drafting its citizens in 1862, many South Carolinians did not approve, and by 1863, many of them had either evaded the draft or deserted the military, often moving to the northwest corner of the state, which earned it the nickname the Dark Corner. During World War II, nearly 2 out of 3 South Carolinians were rejected from the draft because of illiteracy or bad health. Then, during the Korean War, South Carolina had nearly double the rejection rates of other southern states due to, again, illiteracy or bad health. And when men started to be drafted for the Vietnam War, South Carolina had the highest rejection rates in the country due to, again, illiteracy and bad health. South Carolinians have many bad memories of the draft and the thousands of men who were injured or even killed. Conscription is very important in understanding U.S. history. It was a very controversial issue that has very serious impacts over the hundreds of years that was enacted. The draft is a very controversial issue that divided the nation in two. Although the draft existed in the past, it could be very easily reinstated, so Americans should reflect on the past before making a decision that could impact our nation severely.